I wasn't looking for Tartaria when I noticed the gap. It was a late 18th century atlas, nothing unusual at first glance. Familiar coastlines, recognizable empires, Russia stretching east, China firmly outlined. But something was wrong, not with what was there, but with what wasn't. Just decades earlier, that same stretch of land had carried a name in bold, confident letters: Tartary. Sometimes Great Tartary, sometimes simply Tartaria. It covered nearly a third of the Asian continent on European maps. And then, without proclamation or controversy, it began to disappear. By the early 1800s, the word had thinned. By mid-century, it was effectively gone. No academic outcry, no cartographic apology, just silence. The official explanation is tidy: improved surveys, expanding empires, better geographic knowledge, replacing vague medieval terminology. But cartographers were not careless men. They documented revisions, they debated terminology, they justified changes. Yet when Tartaria faded from the page, there was no formal correction, only absence. And absence in history is rarely accidental. If a name disappears from maps, it doesn't just vanish from paper, it vanishes from memory. And that is what makes the case of Tartaria worth examining carefully. For hundreds of years, European scholars used the term Tartary with confidence. It appeared in atlases printed in Amsterdam, Paris, London, and Venice. It was engraved into globes. It was taught in geography lessons. It was referenced in travel accounts and encyclopedias. The word carried weight. Importantly, it was not treated as mythology. When 17th and early 18th century cartographers labeled Great Tartary across northern Asia, they were not inventing a fantasy kingdom. They were using the best geographic conventions available to them. The term functioned as a macro region, similar to how Scandinavia or India has been used in different periods. It was broad, yes, but it was standardized. By the mid-1700s, the name appeared so routinely that few questioned it. Then something changed. Between the late 18th century and the early decades of the 19th, the language of Eurasian geography tightened. Russian territories were more precisely defined. Administrative gubernie replaced older regional descriptors. Chinese frontier regions were integrated under Qing terminology. Central Asian khanates were labeled individually rather than collectively. On the surface, this looks like progress, and in many ways, it was. Surveying improved. Expeditions mapped rivers and mountain ranges with new accuracy. Empires expanded bureaucratically, and maps reflected that control. But when we compare editions of atlases printed only a few decades apart, the speed of the shift stands out. A 1760s atlas may still show Great Tartary dominating the north, and 1820 edition from the same publishing tradition often does not. The landmass remains, of course, but the continental scale name is gone. In its place are subdivisions aligned almost perfectly with imperial borders. There is no transitional label such as formerly Tartary, no footnote explaining the retirement of the term. It is simply absent, and this absence extends beyond cartography. By the early 19th century, European history books begin treating Tartars primarily as medieval invaders associated with the Mongol expansions of the 13th century, rather than as inhabitants of a vast contemporary region. The geographic identity narrows into an ethnic or historical footnote. That narrowing matters, because when a name shifts from geography to distant history, it changes how the present is understood. A region once perceived as a broad cultural expanse becomes fragmented into administratively controlled territories. The story becomes one of imperial integration rather than continental continuity. Was this intentional, or was it simply intellectual refinement? The mainstream explanation remains straightforward. As knowledge improved, vague medieval terminology became obsolete. Tartary was imprecise. It lumped together dozens of distinct peoples and landscapes. Modern scholarship prefers specificity. That reasoning is valid, but precision alone does not explain the uniformity of the disappearance. Cartographic traditions were competitive. French and British mapmakers did not automatically mirror Russian administrative language. And yet, across multiple countries, within a relatively tight window of time, the same broad term receded. It wasn't replaced by a single alternative word. It was replaced by state-aligned divisions. At the same time, the late 1700s were reshaping global power structures. The American Revolution had just demonstrated that maps and sovereignty were inseparable. The French Revolution would soon redraw Europe ideologically as well as politically. Empires recognized that territory was not only land, it was narrative. Names on maps were declarations. To label a region loosely was to imply ambiguity. To label it as imperial territory was to imply authority. Consider Siberia. Earlier maps sometimes placed it within Tartary, sometimes adjacent to it. By the early 1800s, Siberia was firmly embedded within the Russian Empire on European maps, its identity administrative rather than regional. This shift aligns almost perfectly with Russia's consolidation of eastward control. Again, this may be simple cause and effect. Empires formalize land, maps follow. But then we must ask, why was the term Tartary maintained for centuries during earlier phases of Russian expansion, only to disappear during this specific era of consolidation? The word had survived the Mongol decline. It survived the rise of Muscovy. It survived the early Romanov dynasty. It even survived the Enlightenment's demand for rational classification. Yet it did not survive the turn of the 19th century. There is also a psychological dimension to consider. Tartary evoked something vast and undefined to European audiences. It suggested frontier, remoteness, otherness. Removing it reduced that sense of continental mystery. The map became cleaner, more orderly, more controlled. Standardization often accompanies centralization. Printing technology improved in this period. Atlases were mass-produced in greater numbers. Educational curricula became more uniform. When a term was dropped from leading atlases, it could disappear from classrooms within a generation, and that appears to be what happened. By the mid-1800s, the average European student no longer encountered Tartaria as a living geographic concept. It existed, if at all, as a relic in older books. There was no public debate about this, no controversy recorded in academic journals. The retirement of the name was quiet, and quiet changes can be the most profound. This does not suggest hidden continents or erased superpowers. There is no credible evidence of a unified global Tartarian empire in the conventional sense, but the disappearance of the term itself is historically verifiable. A word that once covered millions of square miles was removed from common usage in less than a century. That is not myth. It is observable. The question is not whether the land existed. It did. The question is why the conceptual framework for describing it shifted so decisively, and why the transition left so little visible debate behind. If you've ever studied old maps yourself, you may have noticed similar vanishing terms names once common that now feel foreign. When did they leave? Who decided? And why do some labels linger for millennia while others dissolve almost overnight? History is often shaped as much by what is removed as by what is added. And in the case of Tartaria, the removal was thorough. If we follow the paper trail forward from that disappearance, something else begins to surface. Not evidence of a hidden empire, not proof of deliberate erasure, but a pattern of consolidation that reshaped how Eurasia was described to the Western world. In the late 1700s, Russia was no longer a distant European kingdom pushing cautiously eastward. It was an expanding imperial machine. Under Catherine II, administrative reforms reorganized vast territories into governorships. Census-taking improved, military forts became cities, trade routes hardened into infrastructure. On paper, this meant clarity. But clarity has a cost. Earlier European maps often distinguished between Russian Tartary, independent Tartary, and Chinese Tartary. These were imperfect labels, but they acknowledged gradation areas of influence rather than absolute control. By the early 1800s, that gradation had largely vanished. What had been labeled as independent Tartary in some 18th century maps was gradually absorbed into categories aligned with Russian protectorates or emerging Central Asian khanates described individually. The Qing Dynasty's western territories were labeled according to Chinese administrative names. The ambiguous middle ground disappeared. This shift coincided with another development, the professionalization of geography. Geographic societies formed in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. Exploration reports were standardized. Coordinates replaced approximations. The Enlightenment's appetite for classification demanded order. Tartary, by definition, was disorderly. It was a European umbrella term applied to lands that Europeans did not fully understand. As information increased, the intellectual tolerance for umbrella terminology decreased. Yet the speed of the linguistic correction remains notable. If this were merely academic refinement, we might expect a gradual redefinition, perhaps Tartary, now Siberia, appearing for several decades. Instead, once leading atlas publishers moved away from the term, others followed quickly. Printing networks were interconnected, plates were copied, educational materials were derived from dominant editions. Once the most respected cartographic houses revised their templates, the change propagated efficiently. This is not evidence of conspiracy, it is evidence of influence. And influence shapes memory. There is also the geopolitical reality of the Great Game, emerging in the 19th century, the strategic rivalry between the Russian Empire and the British Empire over Central Asia. As competition intensified, vague terminology became strategically inconvenient. Diplomacy requires defined borders. Military planning requires defined borders. Intelligence reports required defined borders. Tartary did not offer that. When British officers mapped Afghanistan, when Russian envoys negotiated in Bukhara, they did not speak in terms of Great Tartary. They spoke of specific khanates, provinces, and protectorates. The language of statecraft replaced the language of medieval geography. And once statecraft dictates terminology, academia often follows. There is another subtle shift during this period. Ethnography begins to replace regional generalization. Where earlier European texts might refer broadly to Tartars, 19th century scholarship increasingly categorized Tatars, Kazakhs, Kyrgyz, Uzbeks, Bashkirs, and others as distinct groups. This refinement was intellectually meaningful, but it also fragmented the identity implied by the older term. A single continental label dissolved into dozens of ethnographic entries. Again, this can be interpreted as progress. Yet it raises a deeper question. Why do some macro-regional names survive increasing precision, while others do not? Arabia remains in use despite vast cultural distinctions within it. Scandinavia persists despite multiple sovereign states. Even Central Asia today functions as a broad, modern construct. Why was Tartary uniquely retired rather than redefined? One possibility is linguistic discomfort. The word itself carried medieval associations, with the Mongol invasion's memories of devastation in Eastern Europe. Over time, Tartar, in Western literature, became almost mythic, sometimes conflated with Tartarus, the underworld of Greek mythology. The term accumulated dramatic undertones. In an age striving for rational Enlightenment order, perhaps such a word felt archaic. There is also the matter of imperial image. For Russia in particular, being perceived as ruling over Tartary may have implied governance over something culturally alien and loosely defined. Reframing those lands as integral provinces of the Russian Empire projected stability and legitimacy. Names can domesticate territory. By renaming regions administratively, empires reduce the sense of frontier. The map becomes a statement of cohesion rather than conquest. And so, by the mid-19th century, the transformation was complete. Tartary survived in older atlases stored in libraries. It lingered in antique globes, but in current publications, it had been replaced by a mosaic of imperial jurisdictions. No dramatic decree marked the change. No single document announced the retirement. It was a process efficient, coordinated by shared intellectual currents rather than overt conspiracy. Still, the result was profound. Within 2 generations, a term that once described nearly a third of Asia ceased to exist in common geographic language. If you have ever encountered the word unexpectedly in an antique book, you may have felt that brief disorientation, a sense that the world once looked different. And perhaps that is the most important observation here. The land did not change. The mountains did not move. The rivers did not vanish. Only the name did. And when a name disappears, the story attached to it often fades as well. By the mid-1800s, the word Tartary had largely retreated into archival obscurity. But the disappearance of a name does not happen in isolation. It reflects something deeper, a shift not only in geography, but in historical framing itself. In earlier European writings, Tartary was often described as a vast, formidable expanse, sometimes feared, sometimes romanticized. It was portrayed as the homeland of horse-mounted empires, of steppe confederations that once altered the course of continents. Even when inaccurate, the narrative granted the region a kind of sweeping cohesion. That cohesion dissolves in the 19th century. History textbooks begin presenting Central and Northern Asia not as a broad civilizational zone, but as a series of annexations and frontier campaigns. The storyline changes. Instead of a land with its own continental identity, the region becomes a backdrop to Russian expansion, Qing consolidation, and later, Imperial rivalry. This reframing is subtle but significant. When a territory is described as Tartary, it suggests an entity undefined, perhaps, but conceptually whole. When the same territory is described as fragmented provinces gradually incorporated into empires, the emphasis shifts to the conqueror. The narrative center moves westward. At the same time, archaeology and anthropology were emerging as formal disciplines. European scholars began cataloging ruins, artifacts, burial mounds. They documented petroglyphs across Siberia and Central Asia. They uncovered remnants of steppe cultures far older than the Mongol period. Yet these discoveries were folded into specialized studies rather than into a revived continental label. The name did not return. Instead, the past of the region was atomized: Scythians here, Huns there, Mongols later. Each culture treated separately, each era compartmentalized. The connective tissue implied by Tartary was not restored. One could argue this reflects improved accuracy. The steppe was never politically unified under a single state for centuries at a time. It was dynamic, shifting, composed of alliances and migrations. But then again, many historical regions were equally fluid and yet retained enduring names. Consider Persia, which endured through dynastic collapse, or China, whose internal fragmentation did not eliminate the overarching civilizational term in European usage. Tartary, by contrast, was allowed to expire. There is also the issue of scale. Older maps portrayed Tartary as immense, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific. To modern viewers, that scale feels almost exaggerated. It visually dominated Asia. Once subdivided, that dominance disappeared. The eye no longer encountered a single sweeping label, but a mosaic of smaller names. The psychological effect changed. Cartography influences perception more than we often acknowledge. A large, bold word across a continent suggests unity and weight. Remove it, replace it with fine-lined administrative borders, and the sense of vastness shifts. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were also an age of empire asserting permanence. Russia sought recognition as a European power, equal to France and Britain. Qing China defended its western frontiers aggressively. Both had reason to present their territories as coherent and stable. Ambiguous continental labels did not serve that purpose, and yet there remains an intriguing archival silence. When historians discuss the evolution of Central Asian terminology, they often describe it as a natural transition. But few address the visual abruptness seen in comparative atlases. Few explore why the term was not gradually phased into historical context, but rather largely abandoned in contemporary description. It is as though an editorial decision was made collectively, not in a secret chamber, but through shared intellectual momentum. Once enough influential mapmakers stopped printing the word, it ceased to exist in practical discourse. Memory followed print. And this is perhaps the most understated lesson in the entire story. History books do not only record the past, they filter it. When a generation grows up without encountering a term, that term's conceptual framework dissolves. Future scholars work within the vocabulary available to them. Questions not framed in language are rarely pursued. By the early 20th century, Tartary was treated almost exclusively as an archaic relic, a medieval European misunderstanding of Asia. It was relegated to footnotes, antique curiosities, collector's maps. The transformation was complete. Not through dramatic erasure, not through public decree, but through omission, standardization, and the quiet authority of revised editions. And that raises a final, more reflective question. If a name that once described millions of square miles can fade so thoroughly within a century, what else in our current geographic vocabulary feels permanent but may not be? Because the land remains. It is the labels that change. And when labels change, so does the story we believe about the world. By the late 19th century, Tartary had become a ghost word. It survived in antique shops and rare book collections, pressed into aging paper and fading globes. Scholars occasionally referenced it when discussing medieval European misconceptions. But as a living geographic term, it was finished. And yet, the territory it once described was more active than ever. Railways pushed across Siberia. Telegraph lines stretched from Moscow to the Pacific. Expeditions mapped the Pamirs and the Tian Shan with unprecedented detail. Cities expanded, borders hardened. Military outposts became administrative capitals. In practical terms, the region was being integrated into modern state systems at extraordinary speed, which makes the disappearance of its older continental name even more striking. Because historically, when infrastructure expands into a region, older names often persist alongside new ones. They linger as cultural shorthand. They survive in literature and popular speech. They resist total replacement. But Tartary did not linger in that way. Instead, it became associated almost exclusively with antiquity, with Mongol invasions, with medieval chronicles, with a distant and often dramatized past. The present tense was stripped away. This shift coincided with a broader 19th century habit of organizing the world into civilizational hierarchies. European academic thought increasingly categorized societies according to stages of development: modern, traditional, nomadic, settled. The Eurasian steppe, once grouped under a vast continental label, was reframed as a collection of peripheral zones undergoing civilization through imperial guidance. Language reflected that framing. Tartary implied something expansive and undefined, perhaps even formidable. Administrative terminology implied progress and incorporation. The narrative subtly transformed from one of encountering a vast region to one of bringing order to fragmented frontiers. This reframing was not unique to Central Asia. Similar linguistic shifts occurred in Africa and the Americas as European empires expanded. Broad regional descriptors were replaced by colonial boundaries and protectorates. But in the case of Tartary, the scale of the earlier label makes its disappearance more visible in hindsight. There is also the matter of historiography. As 19th century historians professionalized their craft, they sought primary sources, official records, and state archives. Regions that lacked centralized archival traditions were often interpreted through the lens of the empires that absorbed them. The Russian Imperial Archive became the primary documentary authority for Siberia and much of Central Asia. Qing records framed Xinjiang. The voices embedded in those archives shaped the language of subsequent histories. If state documents did not use the term Tartary, later historians had little reason to revive it. Over time, the absence became normalized. By the early 20th century, the word had acquired a slightly archaic, almost romantic tone in Western literature. It appeared occasionally in poetry or travel writing, evoking remoteness, but in academic texts and official maps, it was obsolete. The process was complete. The name had moved from geography to metaphor. And yet, if we step back, we see that nothing physical justified such total linguistic extinction. The steppes remained vast. The cultures remained interconnected through trade, migration, and shared history. The environmental continuity across Eurasia did not dissolve in 1800. Only the conceptual wrapper changed. Some modern discussions take this observation too far, suggesting hidden civilizations or erased global empires. There is no credible documentary evidence to support such sweeping claims, but acknowledging that exaggeration does not eliminate the quieter historical curiosity. Why do some regional names survive administrative overhaul, while others are erased almost entirely? Why did Tartary, once so dominant in European consciousness, fail to adapt? One possible answer lies in power. Names endure when powerful institutions continue to use them. When institutions shift language, the older term weakens rapidly. In the case of Tartary, the institutions that mattered, imperial governments, geographic societies, universities, publishers, collectively moved on, not necessarily in coordination, but in convergence. And convergence can be as decisive as decree. The 20th century brought revolutions, wars, and ideological realignments to Eurasia. The Russian Empire collapsed, replaced by the Soviet Union. Borders shifted again. New republics emerged after 1991. Yet through all of these transformations, Tartary did not return. The vocabulary established in the 19th century proved resilient, which suggests that the decisive moment was not the Mongol era, nor medieval misunderstanding, but the age of consolidation between roughly 1780 and 1850, when maps standardized, archives centralized, and educational systems aligned. That was when the name slipped beyond recovery. And today, when we encounter it, it feels almost conspiratorial, not because it hides a secret empire, but because it reminds us how thoroughly language can reshape our mental map of the world. The land remains unchanged, but the way we are taught to see it does not. By the time we reach the present, the word Tartaria carries a strange weight. Not because it dominates maps, it does not. Not because it anchors modern scholarship, it doesn't. But because its absence feels louder now than its presence ever did. Search contemporary history textbooks and you'll find the Mongol Empire. You'll find the Golden Horde. You'll find detailed studies of Central Asian Khanates, of Siberian indigenous cultures, of Qing frontier policy, of Russian expansion. The region itself is not ignored. What is gone is the continental umbrella that once held it together in European imagination. And that distinction matters. Because names do more than label territory. They create coherence, they imply scale, they shape how stories are told. When Tartary appeared across early modern maps, it presented Northern Asia as a vast, singular expanse, distant, powerful, mysterious. When the term disappeared, that expanse fractured into state-centered narratives. The story became one of Russian development, Chinese administration, Central Asian regionalism. Each of those stories is valid in its own right, but the shared continental framing dissolved. It is tempting, in the absence of a name, to imagine something dramatic must have been concealed. Yet the historical record suggests something quieter and perhaps more instructive. No global council voted to erase Tartaria. No single empire issued a universal decree banning the word. Instead, knowledge systems evolved in a direction that made the term inconvenient. Cartography professionalized. Imperial borders hardened. Ethnography replaced generalization. Printing standardized terminology. Education systems adopted revised atlases. Within a few generations, the old word no longer fit the intellectual architecture of the age, and so it faded. This process reveals something fundamental about history. We often assume that if something significant existed, it would leave an obvious trail: monuments, declarations, dramatic endings. But language itself can disappear without spectacle. A word can fall out of favor, and with it, a particular way of seeing the world. That does not mean Tartaria was a hidden superpower. There is no credible evidence that a unified global Tartarian empire was erased from official records. The archival material from Russia, China, and Central Asia does not support that narrative. But it does show how fluid geographic identity can be. In the 17th century, Tartary was a practical descriptor for lands beyond firm European knowledge. In the 19th century, it was intellectually obsolete. In the 21st century, it has become a subject of online debate precisely because its disappearance feels abrupt when viewed through surviving maps. What we are witnessing, when we compare those maps, is not the loss of a civilization. We are witnessing the power of classification. Once the framework of knowledge changes, the vocabulary changes with it. And once the vocabulary changes, older frameworks become invisible. There is a cautionary note here. Modern maps feel authoritative. Current terminology feels permanent. Central Asia, Siberia, Inner Mongolia. These labels seem stable, objective, but so did Tartary in 1700. If history teaches anything, it is that geographic language is provisional. It reflects the priorities, power structures, and intellectual habits of its time. When those shift, so do the words. The disappearance of Tartaria from history books is not evidence of a hidden cataclysm. It is evidence of how quietly consensus can move. A term used for centuries can dissolve within decades if institutions no longer find it useful. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this story. Not that something was dramatically erased, but that it didn't need to be. The maps changed. The textbooks followed. And within a century, a name that once stretched across continents survived only in archives, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone curious enough to notice the gap. If you have encountered that gap yourself in an old atlas, in a forgotten globe, in a passing footnote, you are not uncovering a forbidden empire. You are witnessing the mechanics of historical revision in its most ordinary form. And ordinary processes, repeated consistently, can reshape the world just as completely as revolutions. The land remains. The rivers still run from the Altai to the Arctic, but the name that once gathered them together is gone. And in its absence, we are left with a reminder. History is not only written, it is edited. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.